John and I were tired of the city. The noise, the rush, the constant pressure. It was wearing us thin. We'd talked about moving for years, but something always held us back. One evening, over a quiet dinner, we finally decided it was time. We packed up our lives and moved to a small town in the north, where I had a house waiting for us, my stepfather Stephen's place. He had offered it when we first married, but I had always hesitated. Now, after everything, it felt like the perfect escape. I hadn't seen Stephen much lately. Our relationship was complicated. He'd stepped in after my mother died, but there was always a wall between us. He never knew how to be a father, and I never knew how to be his daughter. When we arrived, the house felt just as I remembered, old, a little run-down, but full of potential. Stephen lived nearby, and when he came over to greet us, his presence filled the room. He gave me a hug that lingered too long, and I felt his eyes on me a little too intensely. "Good to see you both," he said. His smile was polite, but there was something behind it I couldn't quite place. As he left, his gaze held for just a second longer than necessary. I felt uneasy, but pushed the thought away. It was just the start of this new chapter. What could go wrong? The first few days in the house were quieter than I expected. John had to leave for a business trip, and it was just Stephen and me. We spent the mornings and afternoons together talking about the past, the house, the town. It was peaceful, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. At first I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the change, or the fact that I hadn't spent much time alone with Stephen in years. But there was something about the way he looked at me, something in his voice that felt too heavy, too intense. He would ask about my life, my feelings, as if he was searching for something deeper than just casual conversation. One evening after dinner, we sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the fields. I could hear the soft rustling of the trees in the wind, but there was this undercurrent of unease in the silence between us. Stephen asked if I was settling in well, and for a moment, his question lingered too long. "You've grown into a beautiful woman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the first time I had heard something like that from him, but this time it felt different, charged. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thanks, Stephen. It's been an adjustment." He smiled, but his eyes didn't leave mine. It wasn't that he said anything out of line, but something in the way he watched me made my skin prickle. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, that the distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. Later that night, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The unease wouldn't go away. It wasn't just his words or his gaze, but the way everything seemed to feel too close. Like a storm was brewing, and I couldn't tell if it was one I was meant to weather or avoid. It was late when Stephen and I sat down together in the living room, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. John had been gone for days, and the days felt endless. The silence between Stephen and me had grown, thick and unspoken, and we both seemed to be circling it like two people unsure of how to move around each other. He'd poured us both a glass of wine, and we talked about the town, about our families, about nothing in particular. But then, as the night stretched on, the conversation took a turn I wasn't prepared for. "I've always thought of you like more than just a daughter," Stephen said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I froze. His words were simple enough, but they carried an unexpected weight, one that I couldn't quite understand. My mind scrambled to process what he had just said, but before I could find a way to respond, his gaze lingered on me. It wasn't the kind of look a father should give a daughter. The air in the room seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, but it felt as though a door had opened, one that shouldn't have been opened. His eyes never left mine, and for a moment, everything inside me screamed to break the tension, to change the subject, to leave the room. But I didn't. I stayed. He reached over, brushing a strand of hair away from my face in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. His fingers lingered on my cheek, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, caught in the storm of confusion, not knowing where the boundaries had gone or why everything seemed to be spinning faster than I could hold on. "Are you okay?" Stephen asked, his voice soft but still holding that edge of something I couldn't define. I nodded, but it didn't feel real. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, trapped in the moment as everything I had believed about him, about us, began to unravel. The weight of the room pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. And then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. He pulled his hand away, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. The air between us wasn't any lighter, but somehow it felt like we both pretended it hadn't just happened. I left the room quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make sense of what had just occurred, but I knew, without a doubt, that something had changed. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. Stephen acted as though nothing had changed, his demeanor the same as it always had been, calm, composed, and distant. But I couldn't shake what had happened between us, the way his words and touch had lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. Every time I saw him, I felt that same tension rising in my chest, an overwhelming mixture of guilt and confusion. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that the moment had been a fluke, a lapse in judgment on his part. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me now was different, sharper, as though he saw me in a way I couldn't understand. There were moments when I caught him watching me from across the room, his eyes not just on me, but through me, like he was trying to figure me out. I tried to avoid those moments, to push them out of my mind. But it was impossible. His presence loomed over me, always there, always waiting. I kept asking myself what I was supposed to do with this feeling, this gnawing uncertainty. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to draw the line that should have been drawn long ago. But another part of me, one that I didn't fully understand, wanted to stay, to explore what had begun to stir inside me, no matter how wrong it felt. The guilt weighed heavily on me. I had a life with John, a marriage I had promised to honor, to cherish. But every time I looked at Stephen, I felt like I was being torn in two, caught between loyalty and something I couldn't put into words. There were nights when I stayed up late, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. What did it mean? Why couldn't I stop thinking about that moment? And what was I supposed to do now? I didn't want to acknowledge the truth, didn't want to admit that something inside me had shifted too, but it was there, growing, building, and I didn't know how to stop it. Each day, the emotional distance between Stephen and me grew smaller, and the pull between us seemed to grow stronger. I couldn't escape it, and I couldn't talk to anyone about it. John was gone, Stephen was here, and all I could do was sit with the ache in my chest, trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. A few days after that uneasy evening, Stephen suggested we take a trip. He offered to drive me to a small cabin in the woods, a quiet retreat far from the distractions of the house. At first, I hesitated. The idea of spending more time alone with him made my stomach twist with unease, but I couldn't deny that I needed to clear my head. The tension between us was suffocating, and I needed space to figure out what was happening to me. The drive up to the cabin was peaceful. The roads wound through dense forests, and as the miles ticked by, the world seemed to grow quieter, more distant. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rustic cabin that seemed to be built into the very earth itself. It felt like we had stepped into another world, one where nothing could touch us, where everything was muted and still. We settled into the cabin, unpacking in silence. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and wood smoke filled the space. Stephen suggested we take a walk, and I agreed, anything to break the growing tension that had settled between us. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. But as the evening drew on, something began to change. The atmosphere between us shifted once again, a quiet closeness that was almost tangible. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful, but in a way that felt too intimate, too familiar. Every time I looked at Stephen, I saw something different in his eyes. There was a softness there now, a look I couldn't explain, one that made my heart race in a way I didn't want it to. That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch. The sky was dotted with stars and the air was cool against my skin. Stephen handed me a glass of wine, and we talked, slowly, quietly, about the cabin, about the town, about things we hadn't said before. I could feel the walls I had carefully built between us starting to crumble. The distance that had once felt so comforting seemed to evaporate, replaced by a warmth that pulled me in, closer and closer, and for the first time since arriving, I couldn't breathe. I've always thought about what it would have been like if things had been different, Stephen said, his voice low as if he were sharing something deeply personal. If we hadn't been separated by so much time, by so many things. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The words were vague, but the weight behind them was undeniable. I tried to focus on the peaceful surroundings, to pretend that nothing had changed, that everything was just as it should be, but the truth was, I could feel the tension between us growing, and I didn't know how to stop it. The night dragged on, and I found myself caught between the pull of something wrong and the comfort of something I couldn't quite understand. The boundary between us was blurring, and I didn't know if I wanted to stop it, or if I even could. As the days passed, I couldn't ignore the changes between Stephen and me. The isolation of the cabin had stripped away the usual distractions, and with each passing hour, I felt more and more unsettled. The distance I had once relied on, emotional and physical, seemed to be disappearing. It wasn't just that I was closer to him in proximity, it was something deeper, a shift in how we related to each other. Every glance Stephen gave me seemed charged with a quiet intensity. It wasn't obvious at first, but I could sense it. The way he lingered just a moment longer when we spoke, the way his tone softened when he addressed me, it was like he saw me in a way he hadn't before. The emotional gap between us had closed, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. It wasn't that I had any romantic feelings toward him, but the familiar boundaries I had taken for granted, those lines that kept us at a safe distance, felt blurred. I found myself unsure of where I stood or even how I should behave. Should I push him away, remind him of the space we needed, or should I allow this new closeness to unfold, whatever it meant? That night, after dinner, we sat by the fire. The soft crackle of the flames filled the silence, but there was an underlying tension between us. We spoke about trivial things, about the weather, about the cabin, but the conversation felt forced. It was like we were both avoiding the elephant in the room, the unspoken shift in our relationship. "You've always had this strength about you," Stephen said, looking into the fire rather than at me. "You've grown into someone remarkable." The words were kind, but there was something in the way he said them that made my heart race. I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that I felt uncomfortable exactly. It was more like I didn't know what to make of the closeness that had suddenly surfaced between us. I wanted to pull away, to push back the growing uncertainty, but I didn't. I stayed, uncertain of my own feelings and unwilling to confront them fully. There was a quiet pull between us, like two forces in a gentle tug of war, each one unsure how to let go. As the night wore on, I felt the weight of my own confusion pressing in on me. I couldn't deny that something had shifted, but I wasn't sure what it meant or what I should do with it. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it became impossible to avoid. The next morning, the air felt heavier, filled with everything we hadn't addressed. The unease was palpable. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed, but I didn't know how to move forward. What had happened between Stephen and me was something I couldn't explain, and perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. When John finally returned from his business trip, it was as if he could feel the change in the air the moment he walked through the door. He didn't say anything at first, but I could see the way his eyes scanned the room, the way he took in the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the too long silences, the way Stephen and I interacted with each other. It didn't take long for him to bring it up. That evening, after dinner, He pulled me aside, his face tense. "What's going on between you and Stephen?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that I hadn't heard before. He wasn't angry, not yet, but I could hear the concern in his tone. He had noticed something. I knew he had. I felt my stomach twist into knots. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. I couldn't find the right ones. How could I explain the growing unease, the sense of shifting boundaries, the quiet tension that had been building between Stephen and me without sounding wrong? I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaky. The truth felt too heavy to speak. I wanted to tell him everything, but the weight of my own confusion kept me silent. I didn't know how to articulate the mess I had found myself in. How could I explain something that felt like it was spiraling beyond my control? John's eyes searched mine, looking for the truth I was unwilling to say. His expression shifted from concern to something else, something darker. "I can't believe this. Are you telling me you haven't felt it too?" His words cut through me like a knife. It wasn't a question anymore. He already knew, or at least he thought he knew, and the hurt in his voice was unmistakable. I couldn't speak. I couldn't find the words to tell him the truth, to apologize, to explain that it wasn't what he thought, that I had done nothing wrong, but still felt like I was on the verge of something I couldn't stop. "You have to tell me what's going on," John continued, his voice breaking. This isn't normal. This isn't right." I could see the devastation in his eyes, the heartbreak that I had caused without meaning to, and in that moment, I realized how much I had hurt him. I had been so lost in my own confusion, so tangled in my emotions, that I hadn't seen how deeply my actions had affected the person who mattered most to me. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage, but the words felt hollow. I couldn't undo the damage. I couldn't take back what had already been said, what had already been felt. The distance between John and me was widening, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap. John didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, looking at me like he didn't know who I was anymore. Then, finally, he turned away, his face crumpling with emotion, and walked out the door without another word. And just like that, everything changed. The life I thought I had, the security I had taken for granted, crumbled in front of me. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next, a haze of guilt, confusion, and shame. I stayed in the house after John left, the silence of it echoing through the rooms. I couldn't bring myself to leave, not yet. I knew I needed to, knew I had to escape the weight of everything that had happened, but the thought of facing what I had done, what I had allowed to happen, felt unbearable. Stephen hadn't said much since the confrontation. He acted as though nothing had changed, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the air between us. There was no comfort in his silence. It only reminded me of the brokenness of everything that had once felt so solid, so certain. One morning, I woke up and knew it was time to go. I had to leave the house, leave the town, leave everything behind. I couldn't undo what had happened. Couldn't take back the moments that had slipped through my fingers like sand. The guilt was a constant companion, and I knew I had to find a way to live with it. I packed my things in a daze, not really thinking about where I would go, just knowing I couldn't stay. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was running toward. All I knew was that I needed to put distance between myself and the wreckage I had left behind. I needed to escape the life I had once known and find something, anything that could make sense of the mess I had made. I drove for hours, not knowing exactly where I was going, but needing to be somewhere else, somewhere I could breathe without the suffocating weight of my actions hanging over me. I ended up in a small city, miles away from the house, from Stephen, from John. It was a fresh start, but it didn't feel like one. I couldn't outrun the truth, couldn't hide from what I had done. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were days when the guilt was too much to bear, when the memories of what had happened kept me up at night, but slowly I learned how to move forward. I found a new job, a new place to live, new people who didn't know who I had been before, but I couldn't erase the past. It would always be there, a part of me that I had to carry, a weight I had to learn to live with. I never spoke to Stephen again. I tried to reach out to John, but he had shut me out completely. I understood why. I couldn't undo the damage, couldn't make things right, no matter how hard I tried. The relationship we had, the life we had built, was shattered beyond repair. There were nights when I would lie awake, thinking about what could have been, wondering if things could ever be different. But I knew deep down that the past couldn't be changed. What mattered now was how I chose to move forward, how I chose to rebuild my life from the broken pieces.